Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In my last video I showed you how I got started with Hytale modding, and today is the day we dive into my very first real project, the RuneSword. My goal wasn't just to build a static weapon model, I wanted to create something that evolves. The core concept is a modular sword that dynamically changes its looks and behavior depending on the magical runes you slot into it. It took a ton of trial and error, the project broke completely a few times and it's still far from perfect, but I finally got it working in-game and honestly seeing it in action makes it all worth it. So let's break down how I built it. Let's start with the first phase, the 3D modeling part inside of Blockbench. As I mentioned in my first video, the initial design was inspired by a reference concept I found on Pinterest. One of my biggest challenges early on was the scale. When I tried to implement my first weapon into the game, I made a 3D model for a staff, but it was way too tiny even though I oriented myself off the Hytale character inside Blockbench. To fix this, I imported an official 3D asset from the main Hytale game files directly into my Blockbench project. Using that as a direct reference, I was able to perfectly scale the hilt, the handle, and the blade. I think this is a very important step into learning anything. Look at the people doing what you want to do, analyze the work, and try to copy it with your own style and ideas. I did also heavily oriented myself on the folder structure and group hierarchy around the official Hytale style. Trust me on this, do not skip organizing your outliner, it makes adding things like VFX, trails, animation, and even the simple rotation of your asset in-game possible. At this point, the asset was long from being finished, but the simple 3D structure works, so I moved on to start simple texturing. If you look closely at the model and the reference picture, the defining feature is that it has two designated slots where the runes will eventually fit. To achieve this hollowed out effect without destroying the performance, I used a mix of hidden cubes and flat quads instead of massive, heavy geometry. This is heavily inspired by how official Hytale models handle detail. To carve out the holes and shape the sharp, rounded tip of the blade, I used the texturing and eraser tools. I started by locking the alpha channel so I wouldn't accidentally paint over my invisible pixels, and then I laid down the absolute basic color blocks. Once the rough shape was ready, I did my first ever in-game test to fix the hand position and rotation. The space inside my sword looked like I wanted, but it still looked a little weird when you look at it from certain angles. To fix this, I later implemented walls to the inner side of the rune spaces using quads. You will see the difference in later footage, but it still was part of the simple geometry. With the technical bugs out of the way, it was time for the real texturing. For the texturing phase, I used the Blockbench color palette generator to get some different shades of gray, brown, and some blue. To give the sword a weathered, metallic look, I used a smooth brush to hand paint the gradients, highlights, and shadows. Just like the rest of this project, it was a lot of back and forth testing, but I am incredibly happy with how the final blade texture turned out. A huge inspiration to my progress on texturing the sword came from the Hytale modeling and texturing guides from Leono Creations. In general, this whole project would not have been possible without YouTube tutorials, so even though there is already a lot of slop and a lot of videos talk about the same simple stuff, there are some real gems out there I will link in the video description. So a huge thank you to all the creators out there opening the gates to creating stuff in Hytale for people like myself. Now I only had to implement the finished 3D model and texture inside the game. There I played around with some abilities I could later add to the sword and tried fixing some VFX effect stuff. I'm still struggling with fixing some of the VFX, but with time everything will work out. With the base sword finished, I needed my first element, so I started creating the Fire Rune. I modeled and textured the rune in a completely separate Blockbench project. The plan is to make these runes separate, standalone items that you can obtain and use them to craft upgraded weapons, though I haven't implemented the actual recipes or items yet. I do think that a custom crafting system, like being able to change the stones in the sword on a station without needing a new sword, would be really cool, but we will see what I will be able to achieve in the future. Once the rune model was done, I merged its texture back into the main sword asset, changed some little details on the sword itself, and brought it all into the game. To get the First Rune sword version working, I cloned an existing Fire Sword asset from the Hytale files and started tweaking the VFX, the particle trails and custom abilities using the interaction tab. And this is where things got a little chaotic. I went through so much trial and error, and a lot of things just flat out broke, but as developers like to say, it's not a bug, it's a feature. So, right now the sword has two functional abilities. First, pressing your active ability key, Q on my keyboard, allows you to set the ground on fire. I wanted this to be the flamethrower shot from the Hytale assets, but with a different and kind of better animation fitting for sword. So it didn't quite do what I wanted, but it was still kind of cool, so I kept it in. The second ability is really buggy, but I'm leaving it in for now. Whenever your crosshair is locked onto an entity within about 5 blocks, you can literally punch the air and they will burst into flames. It was completely unintentional, but it's honestly pretty fun to play around with. The main thing I wanted to achieve with this is a simple hit the entity and it catches on fire effect, much like the fire spec enchantments in Minecraft or many other games. This works too, but now my version has this kind of buggy but unique twist to it, which I like, so I'm happy. Looking back, I learned an immense amount during this project. I got my first real look into how deep the Hytale Asset goes, and I learned vital workflows like locking alpha channels and using reference models for scaling and inspiration. I'm not sure on my next project yet, but we will work on this rune idea in the future and mainly use it to learn basics inside the asset editor and modding in Hytale in general. Um, yeah, try out ideas in gameplay or systems like crafting and a unique progression feeling. I would love to add this basic mod into one bigger project later when I know more and do everything a little cleaner. So stay excited and put some ideas or feedback into the comments. If you want to check out my files, I've got you covered. Over on my Discord server, I will upload all the training documents, my notes, and the actual asset files from this project. I also linked some of the best YouTube tutorials I found, like the texturing guides by Leono Creations, or the tutorials on modding Hytale from Awe Sip. You will see it in the comments. So yeah, let me know your thoughts or any tips you have in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you and bye bye.